police officer once told me a story that I wish I could forget. I've tried to let it go. I've gone weeks without thinking about it, and then something small will happen. A light flickering in a hallway, a phone ringing in an empty room, and the whole thing comes flooding back, like a wound that never closed. He asked me not to use his real name. He asked me not to name the department he worked for, or the county where it happened. He said he didn't care if people believed him. He just needed someone to hear it, so that he wasn't the only person carrying it anymore. So I'll call him Webb. He was a deputy sheriff, 9 years on the force. No history of mental illness, no disciplinary problems. His supervisors described him as one of the calmest officers they'd ever worked with, the kind of man you wanted responding to the worst calls because nothing rattled him. On the night of March 2nd, 2019, at 2:47 in the morning, his dispatch center received a 911 call. Someone had picked up a landline telephone and dialed those 3 numbers. But when the dispatcher answered, no one spoke. The line was open. Someone was there, but there was only silence, and underneath that silence, the dispatcher said she could hear something that made the skin on her arms go cold. She described it as a low, wet sound, like breathing through a mouth full of water, rhythmic and steady, as if whatever was making it had been doing it for a very long time. Standard protocol for a silent call is to attempt a callback and dispatch an officer if no one answers. The dispatcher tried the callback. The phone rang once, then the line filled with a sound she said was not static, not feedback, not anything she'd heard in 14 years on the job. She said it sounded like the phone was being held up to a hole in the earth, and the earth was humming. She pulled up the address registered to the phone line. It was a house on a rural road about 12 miles outside of town. According to county records, the house had been empty for 20 years. The previous owner, a woman who lived alone, had died inside it in 1999. No family, no heirs. The property was never sold. Power disconnected in 2001. Water shut off the same year. And the phone line, the landline that had just called 911, had been officially deactivated in November of 1999. A call had just come from a phone that hadn't existed for 20 years, inside a house where no living person had set foot in 2 decades. Webb was the closest unit, 11 miles out. Dispatch gave him the address and he started driving. He told me that at that point, he felt nothing unusual. He figured it was a system glitch, maybe a crossed wire or a database error. He'd responded to hundreds of welfare checks, and they almost always ended with a locked door and an empty house. He told me that was the last time in his life he ever felt safe in the dark. Webb arrived at the property at 3:09 in the morning. The house sat at the end of a long dirt driveway that had been swallowed by weeds and tall grass. There were no streetlights, no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. Just the tree line pressing in from both sides, and the sound of insects filling the warm night air. He left his cruiser running with the headlights aimed at the house and stepped out with his flashlight. The beam swept across the property and showed him what he expected. A 2-story house with white siding gone gray with age. A porch with a roof that sagged in the middle. 2 windows broken on the ground floor, and a front door warped in its frame. It looked like every other abandoned house he'd ever seen, the kind of place that was slowly being eaten by time. He radioed dispatch, told them the structure appeared abandoned. No vehicles, no signs of life. Said he was going to check the exterior and approached the front door. He moved his flashlight across the front of the house one more time, scanning the windows, the roofline, the broken gutters, and something made him stop. On the second floor, in the window farthest to the right, there was a curtain, white, perfectly clean, no yellowing, no water stains, no mildew. Every other surface on that house was rotting and gray and falling apart, but that curtain looked like it had been hung that morning. It looked like someone had ironed it and placed it there with care, the way you would in a room you expected someone to sleep in tonight. Webb stood there looking at it for a long time. He told me that something shifted inside his chest at that moment. Not fear, not yet. Something quieter than fear. Something that felt like a door opening in a room he didn't know he had. He didn't radio dispatch about the curtain. He kept walking. He climbed the porch steps and the wood groaned under his weight like something waking up that didn't want to be woken. He knocked 3 times, loud, and announced himself. "Sheriff's office. Anybody inside? We received a 911 call from this address." Nothing. No sound, no movement. Nothing but the wind moving through the broken windows, and a silence so thick it felt like a physical thing pressing against his ears. He tried the handle. It turned. The door opened inward with a creak that seemed to last longer than it should have, as if the house was taking a slow breath. Webb stepped inside, and behind him, the insects stopped. The first thing he noticed was the dust. Not a light film, not the kind you wipe off a shelf after a few weeks away. This was 20 years of dust. It covered every surface, like a gray funeral shroud laid gently over the entire interior of the house. The floor, the furniture, the picture frames, the staircase railing, everything buried under 2 decades of slow, silent accumulation, as if the house had been holding its breath since the day its owner stopped holding hers. His flashlight cut through the darkness, and the beam itself was visible in the air because the dust particles were so thick. Every step he took sent tiny clouds rising from the floor, swirling upward into the light like something being disturbed from a long and dreamless sleep. The layout was simple. A narrow hallway with a living room on the left, a dining area on the right, and the staircase ahead leading to the second floor. The wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips. The air was heavy, with a smell that Webb described as mildew and wet earth, and something underneath both of those that he couldn't name, something that reminded him of standing too close to a grave that had just been opened. He radioed dispatch, told them he was inside. Heavy dust, no signs of recent entry. He said the structure smelled like it had been sealed for years. He cleared the living room first. A couch buried in gray dust, a cracked television from the 90s, bookshelves with paperbacks whose spines had faded to white. Everything untouched, everything exactly where it had been left 20 years ago. And then he looked down at the floor. There were no footprints in the dust, none, anywhere. Not in the hallway, not in the living room, not near the staircase. The floor was a perfect, unbroken layer of gray. The only marks were his own boot prints leading from the front door to where he stood. Nothing else, no one else. If someone had picked up a telephone in this house tonight and dialed 911, they'd done it without ever touching the floor. Webb told me his body knew something was wrong before his mind did. His chest was tighter, his jaw was clenched, his fingers were gripping the flashlight hard enough to turn his knuckles white, and there was a feeling growing in the base of his skull, something old, something buried deep in the part of the brain that existed long before language, the part that knows when you're being watched by something that hasn't yet decided what it wants to do with you. There was something else. Something small. The dust he kicked up with each step was settling back to the floor almost immediately. Normally, when you disturb dust in a room, it hangs in the air for minutes, drifting lazily in whatever light is available. But in this house, the particles were dropping back to the floor as if the air itself was pulling them down, as if the house didn't want evidence of his presence to last. He moved out of the living room and turned toward the dining area. His flashlight swept across a long wooden table with 6 chairs tucked neatly underneath, and what he saw sitting in the center of that table made every hair on his body stand on end. I need to stop here for a second, because what I'm about to describe is the part of this story that I haven't been able to shake. It's the part that sits in the back of my head when I'm lying in bed at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, listening to my apartment settle around me. And if you're still here, listening in the dark, alone, with that little voice in the back of your mind already telling you something about this story feels too real, then you're exactly where I was when Webb told me what was on that table. You and we don't turn away from this kind of thing. We can't. So stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't, because I need to know someone else is hearing this, and what comes next is the part I wish I could forget. In the middle of the dining table, surrounded by 20 years of undisturbed dust, there was a cup of coffee, a plain white ceramic mug, no coaster, no saucer. The coffee inside was black, and it was steaming, thin wisps of vapor rising from the surface in slow, lazy curls, drifting into the beam of his flashlight and dissolving into the dark air above the table. It was fresh, not warm, not room temperature, fresh, as if someone had poured it from a pot moments before he walked into the room, set it down gently, and stepped back into whatever darkness they came from. But that wasn't what made Webb's hands begin to shake. What made his hands shake was what he saw around the mug. The dust on the table was completely undisturbed. There was no ring where the mug had been placed, no handprint, no smudge, no trail. The gray layer was as smooth and untouched as every other surface in the house. The mug was simply sitting on top of 20 years of dust, as if it had materialized from nothing, as if the coffee had poured itself into a cup that didn't exist 5 minutes ago. Webb told me that in that moment, something inside him cracked, not loudly, quietly, the way a bone fractures before it breaks. He said the room suddenly felt like a stage set, like everything around him was made of paper and paint, and behind the walls there was something else entirely, something vast and dark and aware of him. He stepped backward without turning around. He radioed dispatch. His voice had changed, and he knew it had changed, but he couldn't control it anymore. He asked if anyone had visited the property recently, any maintenance crew, any inspector, anyone at all. No one had been to that address in over 7 years. Webb stood in the doorway of that dining room, staring at the steam rising from that impossible cup of coffee. And he told me that for a moment he considered walking out of the house right then, getting in his cruiser, driving away, filing a report that said the house was empty and nothing was found. But he didn't, because his training told him to clear the rest of the structure, and because somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part that was still trying to be rational, he thought there might be an explanation. A squatter with a portable stove, a prank, something human. And then he heard it, coming from directly above his head, coming from the 2nd floor. A sound so faint he almost missed it, but once he heard it, he couldn't unhear it, and it filled every corner of that house like water filling a jar. A child was laughing. It wasn't the kind of laughter you hear on a playground. It wasn't the sound of a child running through a sprinkler or chasing a dog across a yard. This was different. A giggle, high and bright and rhythmic. The sound a small child makes when they're playing a game that only they understand, when they found a hiding spot so good that they can barely contain themselves. It was coming through the ceiling, muffled by wood and plaster, but absolutely unmistakable. A child was laughing in a house where no one had lived for 20 years, where the dust on every surface was untouched, where no footprints marked the floor, where a cup of coffee had appeared from nowhere, and whatever part of Webb's brain was still trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening, that part went silent. He drew his weapon. His training pushed through the fear the way a fist pushes through thin ice. A child might be in danger. A child might be trapped. And whatever else was happening, he had a duty to go up those stairs. He took the staircase one step at a time. Each step groaned under his weight. The dust was just as thick up here, and his boots left deep prints, the only prints on the entire staircase. No one had climbed these stairs. Not tonight, not for 20 years. The laughter was louder now. It was coming from the room at the end of the hallway, the room farthest to the right, the room with the clean white curtain. 3 doors lined the hallway. The first 2 were open, empty bedrooms with bare mattresses and dust-covered dressers, abandoned, dead, normal. The third door was closed, and it wasn't just closed. It had been nailed shut from the outside. Dozens of nails, maybe 40 of them, hammered through the door and into the frame in a pattern that looked frantic and desperate, as if someone had stood in this exact spot with a hammer and driven every nail they had as fast as their arms could move. The nails were rusted, and they'd been there for years, maybe the entire 20 years. And behind that door, the child was still laughing, clear, bright, joyful, playing happily in a room that someone had sealed shut with 40 nails and never opened again. Webb told me that every cell in his body was telling him to leave. Every survival instinct written into his DNA across 1,000,000 years of evolution was firing at once, flooding his blood with adrenaline, screaming at him to turn around and run. But he was an officer, and behind that door, there might be a child who needed help. He keyed his radio, his voice barely holding together. He told dispatch he was on the 2nd floor, that he had an interior door nailed shut, and that he could hear what sounded like a child laughing inside. He requested backup. The nearest unit was 22 minutes away. Webb stood in front of that door, weapon drawn, flashlight shaking in his hand, staring at the rusted nails, listening to the laughter rise and fall on the other side of the wood. He told me he was trying to figure out how to open it. No pry bar, no tools. He would have to kick it in, and with that many nails it could take 5 or 6 tries. And then the laughter stopped. The house went completely silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that has texture, that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of the blood moving through your own skull. The kind of silence that feels like something is holding its breath. And then something on the other side of that door knocked 3 times, slow, deliberate, spaced exactly 2 seconds apart. The same pattern Webb had used when he knocked on the front door of this house 20 minutes ago. The exact same rhythm, the exact same force. And then, after the 3rd knock, a voice came through the wood, muffled, small, unmistakably a child's voice, and it said in a tone that was playful and sing-song and horribly, impossibly wrong, "Sheriff's office. Anybody inside?" His words, the exact words he'd spoken at the front door downstairs, every syllable, every inflection, repeated back to him in a child's voice from behind a door that had been sealed with 40 rusted nails for 20 years. And then the voice said it again and again, faster each time, overlapping with itself, as if there were 2 children behind that door, then 3, then 5, all repeating his words in a chorus that was getting louder and higher and more frantic. like a recording being played forward and backward at the same time, the words losing their shape, dissolving into something that no longer sounded like language. Webb stumbled backward. He didn't walk, he stumbled, nearly falling, his back hitting the hallway wall. He kept his weapon pointed at the door, and his flashlight shaking violently against it, and he began moving toward the staircase without turning around, without taking his eyes off that door, because every instinct he had was telling him that if he looked away from it even for a second, it would open. The voices behind the door stopped all at once, as if someone had pressed a button, and on his way down the stairs, his flashlight found something he'd missed on the way up, something that had been waiting beneath the staircase the entire time. At the bottom of the staircase, tucked into a recessed alcove that he hadn't noticed before, because it had been behind him when he climbed the stairs, there was a door. Everything about it was wrong. It was brand new. The wood was smooth and clean, painted a fresh, bright white. The paint still carried that faint chemical smell of something recently applied. The hinges were polished brass. The doorknob was brushed nickel, modern, without a scratch on it. There wasn't a single particle of dust anywhere on its surface. In a house where everything was 20 years dead, where the air tasted like decay, and the walls were peeling, and every surface was buried under gray, this door looked like it had been installed an hour ago. It was so clean, so aggressively new, that standing next to the rotting walls of the house, it looked like a wound, like someone had cut a hole in the fabric of the house and placed something behind it that did not belong. And it was open, slightly, maybe 2 inches, just enough to see complete darkness on the other side. Just enough to feel cold air pushing up through the gap, carrying a smell that Webb described as wet soil and flowers. Not garden flowers, funeral flowers. The heavy, sweet, suffocating scent of lilies piled around a casket. Webb stood 3 feet from that door, his weapon in his right hand, his flashlight in his left. He told me that at this point, his body was no longer fully under his control. His hands were shaking so badly that the flashlight beam was jumping across the walls. His breathing was fast and shallow, and his heart was slamming against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He keyed his radio one final time. His voice came out in pieces, broken and thin. He told dispatch there was a door leading to a basement or cellar. He told them it didn't match the house. He told them he was going to open it. Dispatch asked him to repeat. He didn't. He reached his left hand toward the door. As his arm extended, his flashlight shifted, and the beam dropped from the center of the door to the floor. And for the first time, it illuminated the gap between the bottom of the door and the dusty hardwood. And in that gap, pressed flat against the floor from the other side, were fingers. Small, pale, 4 of them, curled under the door, resting on the wood without moving. They were the size of a child's fingers. The nails were long and dark, with something crusted underneath them, and they were completely still, the way something is still when it has been waiting in the same position for hours, or days, or years. Webb's body locked. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't look away. The flashlight beam was trembling on those fingers, and the fingers were not moving, and the seconds were stretching out like taffy, and the house was so quiet that he could hear the blood rushing through his own ears. And then the fingers moved. Slowly, they uncurled, pressing flat against the floor, spreading wide as if the hand was stretching after a long sleep. And then they began to pull back, dragging across the dusty wood with a dry, scraping sound that Webb said he can still hear when he closes his eyes at night. They slid back under the door, back into the darkness, as if whatever was on the other side had realized it had been seen and was retreating just far enough to wait. Webb stepped back. He raised his weapon. He told me he might have said something out loud, something from his training like, "Don't move," or "Show yourself," but he doesn't remember. His memory of those seconds is fractured, like a mirror that's been cracked but hasn't fallen apart yet. He turned toward the front door. He was going to leave. He was going to walk out and never come back. He took one step, and from behind that door, from somewhere deep below the house, a voice drifted up through the darkness. It was not a child's voice this time. It was calm, measured, patient, the voice of something old that had learned how to shape words the way a person shapes clay, carefully and without understanding what the words actually mean. It said his name, not his badge number, not officer, not deputy, his first name, the name his mother called him when he was small, the name that wasn't on his uniform, wasn't in any database dispatch could access, wasn't printed on any document in his cruiser, a name that no one in that county used because he'd gone by his middle name since he was 12 years old. And then the voice said it again, softer this time, the way you would say someone's name if you were trying to lull them to sleep. And then again, even softer. And Webb realized that the voice was getting quieter, not because it was fading, but because it was moving away, going deeper, descending into whatever was below that door, pulling his name down with it, like a stone sinking into black water. Webb doesn't remember leaving the house. His next clear memory is sitting in his cruiser, with the doors locked and the engine running, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, staring at the front door of the house through his windshield. He doesn't know if he walked out or ran. He doesn't know if he closed the door behind him. There are 4 minutes of his life that simply do not exist. When backup arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers cleared the house together. They went through every room, every closet, every corner. There was no coffee on the dining table. There was no laughter on the second floor. The door at the end of the upstairs hallway was closed, but not nailed shut. No nails, no holes where nails had been. Just a plain wooden door that opened into an empty bedroom with a bare mattress and a window with no curtain. And there was no door under the staircase. No alcove, no recess, just a solid wall of old plaster with 20 years of dust settled undisturbed against its base, as if the door had never been there, as if the house had swallowed it back into itself the moment Webb stopped looking at it. The only evidence that anything had happened was Webb's footprints in the dust. They went from the front door to the living room, to the dining area, up the stairs, down the hallway, back down the stairs. At the bottom of the staircase, the prints stopped for a long time in front of a blank wall, and then they turned sharply toward the front door and did not slow down. Webb resigned 11 days later. He told me he hasn't worked since. He lives in a small apartment with every light on a timer, so they never all go off at once. He doesn't own a phone with a landline. He sleeps with the television on because he can't fall asleep in silence anymore. When he finished telling me this, I asked him the question I know you're asking right now. I asked him if he thought he imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, the dark playing tricks on a mind that was running on caffeine and adrenaline at 3 in the morning. He looked at me for a long time before he answered, and when he did, his voice was steady for the first time since he'd started talking. He said, "Nobody has called me by that name since my mother died. She's been gone for 15 years, and that voice in that basement, it sounded exactly like her." I didn't have anything to say to that, and lying here tonight, in my apartment, with the lights on and the city noise outside my window, I still don't. The house is still standing. The phone line is still disconnected, and 3 more 911 calls have come from that address since Webb's visit. No one has been sent to answer them. And if you hear your phone ring tonight, in that dead hour between 3 and 4 in the morning, when the world is at its quietest and the darkness outside your window feels like it's pressing in, don't answer it. Because it might not be for you, but whatever is calling already knows your name. This has been Ashen Frequency. The story's over, but if you're being honest with yourself, you know something about it followed you here. Good night.